Well, thank you all so much for attending my talk on OpenPhone's 2024 Year in Review campaign. When we set out to create our first year in review email, we felt really strongly that we wanted to include dynamically generated charts to showcase our customers' data. And so the focus of this talk is really the technical challenge of figuring out how to dynamically generate hundreds of thousands of charts to embed in this email with almost no budget and no software engineering resources. So today I'll discuss how we solve that challenge. And although the talk gets a little bit technical at times, my primary goal is to challenge your assumptions around the kinds of experiences that we as marketers are capable of creating without any formal coding through the use of no code tools, AI, and good old fashioned Googling. First off, a little bit about me. My name is John MacGaffey. I've been at OpenPhone for a little over 3 years and have worn a lot of hats during that time, from helping manage the website to starting our affiliate program. But today I'm primarily responsible for our marketing ops and lifecycle. This project was, as you might expect, very much a team effort. So I want to give a quick shout out to the collaborators that I had in making this possible. Carolyn Gardner designed the email. She's a phenomenally talented designer. Phil Jones on our data team created the data model that powered this. And then Brian Sun, our lifecycle consultant, helped with strategy and implementation. Today, we'll start off with a quick overview of the project. We'll dive into how we created the charts and then refined those charts with the help of AI. And then we'll dive into the technical details of actually like building out this campaign within Customer IO, followed by some time at the end for a little question and answer. To start off, OpenPhone is a collaborative phone system for teams. It brings your calls, texts, and contacts into an app that works across all your devices. And with our shared numbers feature, teammates can work together to support customers. You can also use AI to transcribe and summarize calls, provide next steps, and more. So it's a really beautiful way of staying in touch with your customers. And as such, we wanted a way to bring all of that calling and texting data to life in this year in review email. The goal of the project was probably pretty similar to the goal of any kind of year in review recap campaign. We wanted to create a delightful experience for customers that summarized their entire year's OpenPhone activity. And we also wanted to make it shareable. So we embedded a little link to share on X the stats that we had surfaced in the email. And let's take a look at what the email itself looks like, just to get a sense for what we're building here today. So here's the header. John's Year Review 2024 with OpenPhone. Here you've got your call to action button. And if we scroll down, you can start to see some of the charts that we embedded. So you have call volume by month, calling out how your OpenPhone usage compared to other OpenPhone customers in your industry. We've got the total call minutes here by month, as well as messages and this fun scatter chart of your busiest call times to help you visualize over the course of the entire year in aggregate, like which times of the week had your sort of highest call volume. And then we have your individual activity on OpenPhone, how many calls you made, how many after hours calls you had after your business hours, etc. And then this fun little illustration for wrapping things up at the end. So those of you who are familiar with building out lifecycle campaigns, which I assume is all of you on this call, most of this is pretty straightforward to build out. Like it's all pretty much one or two columns, just a few images embedded, and then all these charts. And the charts is where this gets fun. So let's dive in. The tech stack looks something like this. So we have our customer data stored in Snowflake, and we use Census as our reverse ETL tool. So Phil on the data team created a data model that we loaded into Census that helped pull all of that data out of Snowflake and then imported it either as a customer attribute within Customer IO or as an event, the whole series of event attributes to actually populate the data within this email. And then we used webhooks to connect Customer IO to QuickChart in order to actually build and dynamically generate all of these charts. QuickChart is a service that lets you generate charts based on templates. There's a no code option and an API that lets you go full code, but I'll be walking through a low code implementation today and try and make it sort of as accessible to folks as possible, even if you don't have experience with webhooks or working with an API, or even with like no code tools in general. This is a screenshot of the header of their homepage. And I think it does a pretty good job of illustrating exactly how it works. And so what you see here is a URL that is populated with a handful of settings, as well as the data in order to display the chart. So you can see like the Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 in that array there. That's what's populating the x-axis. And you can see type equal to bar, and that's what's telling it exactly what type of chart to generate. So ultimately, our goal here is to create a URL for each of these charts that we can then pass into customer IO and embed. So at the end of the day, QuickChart is just a GUI editor for an open source JavaScript library called Chart.js. It's really well documented. There's plenty of like forum posts that you can search across the internet if you run into trouble generating something. But at a high level, there's a really intuitive editor for building out these charts yourself, particularly those that are maybe like a little bit more simple to implement. So on the left here, you can see we've set a canvas width and height. You can add a background color as well as padding. It's kind of not dissimilar from building out something in Customer IO, adding your colors, your fonts, your padding, etc. And once you're done getting the chart as close to the design as possible, you can either stop there and click on share and get your URL and share that and populate the data in that URL, or you can dive into Chart.js's, QuickChart's advanced editor, which looks like this. On the left, you'll see a long list of settings that GUI editor helped generate for us on the previous screen. This is formatted in something called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. You don't really need to be familiar with JSON in order to get a kind of surface level idea of what's going on here. So let's zoom in on that JSON just to sort of help illustrate how this is working behind the scenes here. So you can see we've got the point style is equal to circle. That's referring to those points on the graph on the previous screen here. You've got the data in this array, just a series of comma separated values. So this 62 right here corresponds with the 62 in January, etc. Right? And so even if like writing all this JSON from scratch might be a little bit intimidating if you're not familiar with like the exact format of what you're working with here, you can at least see what it has spit out and start to add some additional settings and change what's there to sort of play with it a little bit to get it like really dialed into exactly what the design team is hoping to create for an email like this. So when you're done going through and editing the JSON as necessary, then you can go ahead and generate this template URL. I've cut off this URL on purpose because it goes on and on and on and on and on. It's really gnarly. As you can imagine, like converting all of these settings into a single URL is really long. It might look overwhelming at first, but if you spend some time staring at it, you can start to see some of the settings from the previous screen pop out here. You've got span gaps, you've got fill equal to true, etc. But unfortunately for us, this URL is actually too long for some browsers to handle on its own. So we're going to put a pin in that and come back to it a little bit later, where I'll talk through how we actually implement sending a webhook request to QuickChart's API to generate a much shorter version of the URL that doesn't contain all of the settings in just like one long, like infinite string. Before we get to that though, I'd like to talk about how I used AI to help me edit the charts after I had done as much as I could with the QuickChart GUI editor and my own sort of like spelunking through that JSON advanced settings interface. When I was building this back in December, it didn't occur to me that I might be able to just drop an entire screenshot of a chart into Claude and ask it to generate the underlying JSON for me based on that. But while I was preparing for this talk, I was curious to see how it would handle a request like this. And this section is called Refining the Charts with AI and not Creating the Charts with AI because it is, like most things AI today, imperfect. And while you might get lucky and get a perfectly generated list of JSON settings without having to do any editing from it, in my experience, it's going to require like a little bit of refining and ongoing prompting to get it exactly how you like. And so my recommendation would be to start with the GUI editor, and then from there, if there's any setting that you can't figure out through there, start to Google around and drop the JSON into Claude, which is what I used, in order to make the changes that you need. So let's walk through an example of that to show you what that looks like. So here I've embedded a screenshot from Figma in the Claude prompt. I've asked it to convert the chart into a chart.js chart, which is, again, the underlying JavaScript library that QuickChart is using to produce these. And I'm asking it to return only the JSON settings and no other code, because without that part of the prompt, it's going to spit out a bunch of additional JavaScript that I don't need for this. So here you can see it has generated a whole bunch of JSON for me, and I've pasted that back into the advanced editor. And you can see that with very little prompting from me, it's gotten pretty close. On the left here, you've got the original design from Figma, and on the right is what it came up with. Obviously, there's some glaring errors here. Background color is all wrong. The fill is under the line is like an attempt at that, but not quite what we're looking for. But it's doing a better job than I would have guessed it would here. Like the thing that most stands out to me is its ability to parse the data accurately. I really thought that like the background color would be easy, but actually getting the data points would be harder, particularly because we don't have any labels on these data points telling it exactly how many calls that the person received in a given month. But if you look closely at these points here, they actually map like almost exactly onto the underlying data that we used for our example chart from Figma. And so from there, we can go back to Claude and we can say, hey, like, here's that JSON you just gave me. Like, you're doing great so far, but can you please make these chart axis points a little bit smaller? And can you please format the y-axis so that it has the thousands separator comma in it, just to help the readability of the chart? And so Claude goes, yes, of course, spits out a whole bunch of new JSON. It also very helpfully tries to explain exactly what changes it's making to help give you a sense of what it's doing and help sort of audit anything if it's not quite hitting the mark. And let's take a look at how it did with that prompt. So you can see here's like the before Claude generated chart, and here's the after. It totally crushed shrinking these points on the graph, but it totally failed adding the 1,000 separator to the y-axis. And so that's where you're going to have to continue to try refining your prompt. You can try Googling it just to see like, hey, like how do I add 1,000 separator to a y-axis in a chart.js graph, and then dig into the JSON and try and drop in the correct setting. So in order to get the last or like 20% of the design details correct, there was just like a lot of back and forth that I had between Google and Claude trying to figure out how to get it just right. And then once we've gone through and built all those charts and we're happy with the templates and the design is perfect, then we actually have to connect all this back to customer IO. So here's sort of like the basic outline of the campaign. We have an event trigger that's kicking things off. And we have a webhook request block for each of the charts that we're trying to generate, followed by the actual email itself. So let's dive into what one of these webhook requests actually looks like. At the top here, we are telling it to send a post request to this URL. You can get all this from the QuickChart API documentation. And then down here, we're telling it that the payload of the request contains JSON. Down here, this probably looks familiar at this point. We've simply pasted the JSON settings that QuickChart and Claude helped us generate earlier. And in this case, I've added an API key at the top here. It's blurred out, which is why it looks silly. But the API key is what we received after purchasing a paid plan to QuickChart, which was less than $200. It was not a lot of money. And the API key allowed us to generate unlimited charts and keep them online a little bit longer, hosted by QuickChart, just so that the email didn't break as soon as we sent it out. And by dropping that API key, when you send this request over to them, it's telling them like, hey, I'm a paid customer. Please like create as many charts as I want and keep them online. Scrolling down here a little bit, you can see that we've also had to make some changes to the JSON by adding the liquid logic that customer IO needs to actually populate the data dynamically. Because of course, like we're not sending just the template out to every customer, we're sending out their unique data set from 2024. And so here you can see we imported an attribute on the customer object called calls by month. And that contains an array that holds every month of 2024, followed by the total number of calls that they had. So when the webhook request fires, it's actually just sending a number in place of this liquid for each of these values. Once we've set up the initial payload for the webhook, then we also need to go to the next step within Customer IO's interface and tell it what to do with the response. So we've sent out a request to QuickChart, and QuickChart has said, okay, thanks, like that all makes sense. Here's the unique URL for this customer's chart. Previously, when I showed you the URL on its own slide, it was that like gnarly, like super long string, hard to read. This URL is a lot shorter. It doesn't contain all of the settings and data that we passed QuickChart in the webhook request. But QuickChart now has that stored on its server, and the generated chart is ready to be displayed in any web browser, and it's just passing back the direct URL to embed that image into our email. So here, what we're telling Customer IO to do is take that URL from the response, and we're going to set it to a new attribute called chart1. So a customer who's going through this campaign is going to receive the attribute chart1 with the value of the set to the URL of what the webhook returned. And then we're going to repeat that for each of the 4 requests here. This is sort of the most sort of basic implementation of how to set this up. But in practice, there's a couple of things I would do differently. The first is, despite that QuickChart advertises unlimited images, we did run into a hidden limit on their service because we were generating so many charts so quickly. And I realized afterwards there really was no reason to have to create the charts just like minutes before sending the email out. Because if the charts and like templates are all ready to go, there's nothing stopping you from starting this campaign a day early and adding a time delay block after the final webhook request to hold people in until you're actually ready to send the email out. And so if I were to do this over again, I would have generated all those charts a day in advance, made sure they were all good to go. And then for the day of, we actually did have a bunch of random cohort branches to kind of space out the email send given the volume of folks that we were trying to reach there. So within your email template, you're taking the URL from each of these webhook requests, and instead of embedding an actual URL in the image block within the template, you're asking Customer IO to pull that URL from their chart1 or chart2 customer attribute in order to surface it there. And so they went out mostly without a hitch. And in terms of results, we did see an uptick in folks sharing their results on social, which is what we were hoping to see. And I particularly enjoyed seeing this response to PJ on the left from Tree Guy Dave, who said, just scheduled a demo, outgrowing Google Voice. So it was fun to see at least one attributable demo coming from this campaign. And we got a lot of responses to the email as well from folks saying that it was really beautiful and fun to see their data represented that way at the end of the year. That's all I got. Happy to answer any questions folks have on all of that.
Obsessed. I love this email, and I love how you kind of position it as like low resources, low budget, and then you went into like the most detailed presentation around like the complexities and very, very helpful. Everyone in the chat really loved it. We definitely have some questions. So let me pull them up. Okay. This first one was from a DM that I got. How did you decide which customer data points to include?
We were trying to surface the things that we thought were either most interesting or most core to the product experience. So because we're a business phone system, it made sense to include calls and text messages. And because some orgs have such a high volume of calling and messaging activity, it's helpful for them to see how that activity is spread out across the week, because in some cases that's useful for just staffing planning and figuring out sort of your schedule within your team for how many people you need available at any given time to manage those inbound calls and texts. We do have an analytics feature in the product itself, but some of this data was presented in a either like a more accessible way here or in a like slightly different format just to help activate it more.
Okay, that makes sense. I like that answer. Okay, we've got this one from Shad. Have you run into any intermittent API call failures? And how are those handled at SendTime?
Yeah, so I learned through this project that if customer IO receives a failed response back from the server that it's trying to send the webhook to, it actually continues to retry that request over a period of some hours. And so if I understand it correctly, it starts with more frequent retries and that sort of like trails off over time as its confidence in the service's ability to actually handle that request trails off. So I was very pleasantly surprised to discover that Customer IO has this like built in and doesn't just like leave you out to dry if it receives a single failed request. But if it is not able to get a successful response back from the server within a few hours, you will need to just figure out what's going on and run them through the campaign again. Because if the customer is missing a value for any of those chart attributes, the email will fail to send.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I think this one was maybe answered in the chat, but was the JSON generated from a Figma plugin or just asking an external AI to generate it from a screenshot?
The latter, yeah, just dropping a screenshot in. I'd be interested to see what kind of plugins out there would help generate something like that. I bet it would do a better job than, but even working with Cloud, I was consistently impressed with the piece that it was able to solve for.
Makes sense. Okay, well, thank you so much. You're going to have to stick around until the end of the day for the Unpacked email awards. Not teasing anything specifically, but I also could be. I want to thank you for joining us today. That
Yeah,
was such a cool deep
thank
dive.
you. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I hope for folks out there who maybe aren't necessarily planning their own year review campaign, I hope it gives you some ideas around how you can create your own unique and dynamic experiences for customers beyond what you might normally expect to be able to do just within the tool set that Customer IO provides out of the box. So if you have any other follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And thanks again for having me.
Love it. All right.